Okay, we now have another talk. Let me just get the overlay. Okay, so we now have Ryan Chenky. Ryan Chenky is a colleague of mine who's also a full stack developer, JavaScript developer, working at Prisma in developer relations. I'll bring Ryan onto the screen. Hey, Ryan, nice to have
Hey,
you.
thank you for having me.
So I'll give a bit of an introduction about you. So you're doing developer relations for GraphQL at Prisma. You're also a course author, teaching on subjects ranging from the basics of front-end development to full-stack web security. And you also host the Entrepreneurial Coder podcast. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So up to a few different things, but I think you got most of the prominent ones there in your intro there.
Great. Are you ready to give the talk?
Yep, sure am. I can get started.
Okay. Well, gonna need you to share the screen.
Sure. Yep. Let me see. I'm gonna share right here. Let me know if you can see it. Oh, I have to follow some steps to enable permissions, which I should have done prior. Let me do this really quickly. Chrome, where are you?
So while that's happening, gonna go. We had a lot of comments coming in. Great product from Guillermo Bueno. A lot of thank yous. Very interesting from Hendrik Niemann. And Sakayo. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. We're 43 viewers. And Ryan's screen is ready. All right.
All right. Sorry about that. So yeah, my name, like Daniel said, is Ryan, and working at Prisma in developer relations. I've done a lot of dev stuff in the past that has touched on security and authentication, and that was largely through, in a previous life, I worked at Auth0, and so that was from like 2015 to 2017. I worked at Auth0, and then I did some consulting work after that for a couple of years, and I've just recently started up with Prisma. And one of the things that I continue to do in my consulting work is to use Auth0 as a product, because it really did, from everything that I found, looking, I was a bit biased because I worked there, but looking at the market, it was one of the best ways to get an application protected and authenticated and authorized for your users. And so when I was building applications for my clients, I was always using Auth0. I was always reaching for it. And it's definitely, increasing in popularity as a product, as a way for developers to get auth in their apps really quickly. So I figured I would go through and show how you might do this when it comes to a GraphQL-powered application. So the scenario here is we've got this application. This is what I use for a lot of my teaching. A lot of my React security courses use this Orbit application. And this is just like a demo app where users come in and they see some dashboard data and some inventory data. So just, this fictitious kind of application that demonstrates a kind of SaaS product, if you will. And so it's all working with Auth0 now. I've got Auth0 built into it. It's a React front end, it's a Node backend, and it's got Auth0 across the stack. So it's all done. I don't have any slides. I figured what I'd do is I would just kind of do some code spelunking and take a bit of a walkthrough so that you can get a sense of how you would reason about putting these pieces together. So if this approximates your stack, if you've got something like React and GraphQL together and a Node backend, and you're interested in Auth0, perhaps this will be useful for you. And if not, Auth0 works across pretty much any stack that would be served over the web or operate in the web. So you can use it with many other varieties as well. So what we can take a look at first, I suppose, is this Auth0 dashboard. You would need to get started with an account with Auth0. Auth0 gives you many different options to integrate users into your application. But I suppose one of the simplest ways to reason about it is that they give you a database of users. If you want, you can bring your own database, but you can also choose to use their hosted database to store your users. So in this account that I've got for the demo, I've I've just got, one user, that's me right now. You need to create an application when you go in. I've got this single page app record here for my Orbit application. So you'll be prompted to do this when you sign up for an account and start the onboarding flow. But you get your application, you get some of the information that you would need for your front-end application in this case, which is things like the domain and the client ID. And since we're using an API, you need to create an API record as well. So here is the record that I've got for my Orbit API. So this information is going to go in later to our application code. We'll take some of these pieces and we'll build them in. The way that Auth0 works, it's an OAuth OIDC provider. So the way that they're able to be a managed service for authentication is that they abide by this Auth0 spec. And so when your users log into your application, and Auth0 takes care of verifying the user's credentials and all that, in most cases, it's probably typical to the way you would want to use it is they're going to send back an access token that can be consumed at your API. And this access token is going to be a JSON Web Token. If you're not familiar with JSON Web Tokens, you can get some information at jwt.io about how those operate. But you're going to get a way to access your API, to protect and limit access to your API based on JSON Web Tokens, which come in the form of an access token. That's what is used in OAuth. And so that's a bit about how you would get started on the Auth0 dashboard. The first place you would probably look if you're in your application stack here, so let's say you've got your React app set up, you've got your GraphQL API set up, you'd probably want to get started in your app.js or somewhere near the root of your application. And Auth0 provides this kind of newer library. It's called Auth0 React, and it's an SDK for React. It's actually really nice. When I was working at Auth0, we had kind of basic JavaScript, a basic JavaScript library that did everything. It served all purposes. You could use it across any kind of framework you wanted, but it meant that you had to do a fair bit of work to put all the pieces together. But with this Auth0 React library, it's actually quite simple to wire all these pieces up, which is really nice. You can see the library itself and all of the particulars about it here at this this URL Auth0. So it's github.com/auth0/auth0-react. So you're in your React application, and what you'll want to do is bring in your Auth0 provider. I've got that coming in down here near the root of the application. It's actually right at the root. You pass in your Auth0 provider. You can use that to wrap your application. And you want to get those credentials that we saw over on Auth0 side, things like the domain, the client ID, a redirect location. So OAuth, the way that it works is you need to specify a redirect URL so that when users authenticate, they're going to go over to Auth0's domain. And when they want to come back to your application, you need to have something in your allowed list for your application domain so that the whole process can know that it's a legitimate authentication attempt and not something that's not somebody trying to be malicious. Things like an audience that comes into play when we want to talk about which scopes to request and which scopes to use against our API. The audience is going to be a record about our API that we want to make requests against. And we want to have certain scopes. I've got a bunch of these individual scopes listed here. These can be thought of sort of as permissions, I suppose you could think of them as. When you start dealing with Oauth, you get into Oauth and OIDC, you get into these fine-grained scopes, these like little permissions that you can hand out to users based on whether or not they are allowed to get at those scopes. And you can manage that all in the Auth0 dashboard. There's this users, there's this roles area where I've got like an admin and a user level, and I've got certain permissions on these. So in the permissions here, I've got all of these scopes that I've previously created. And typically when we're dealing with scopes, you don't have to do this, but this is a very common pattern. You would say that you've got like an action : the resource that you want to target. So I want certain users to be able to read dashboard data. So read : dashboard, edit : user. I think you get the pattern there. That's typically how you would think about setting up these permissions. And so over in my application, when I request all of these scopes on the initial login, I'm requesting all of them, any possible scope that might exist. But Auth0 is going to take care of knowing whether or not a user should be allowed to get access to a certain scope. So what that means is that even though I'm requesting all these scopes, when a user wants to authenticate, the user is only going to get the scopes that they're actually allowed to have, so that they can't, elevate their credentials or something like that. So over in the application, I suppose we could, take a look. I'm going to log out here, and this isn't going to be very pretty because I don't have it fully set up. Well, I guess I did get the redirect. I was kind of expecting a bigger error there, but I guess that worked okay. So I'm back over at the Auth0 domain that's particular to my tenant on Auth0. And this is a spot where I can log in. This is their universal login widget, which you get right out of the box. Comes kind of prepackaged. You can turn it on and be logging your users in very quickly. So we can log in and we get back to the application. You can take a look at the network tab to see what happens here, especially when I refresh the page. That might be of interest. When I do, I've got this request for a token. And this request for a token, it's giving back a few things. It knows that I'm authenticated. The application knows that I'm authenticated because I've got this session that's alive on Auth0 side. And what that means is that I can request like an access token. I can request that I get certain scopes back, etc. And this process of getting that token will all happen sort of under the hood. It's going to give me back that token that I'm looking for. And the spot where that comes in, and I suppose getting into the GraphQL side of things, this is where you'd want to start to configure your token to go to your API. Typically, I'm sure a lot of us have worked with JSON Web Tokens, or at least maybe seen some things about how they work. Typically, what you'll have is you'll have your front end application and you'll have your API. Your API is protected using a JSON Web Token, meaning that there has to be a valid JSON Web Token that comes to it before it's going to release its resources. And you need to get that token to the API somehow. And the typical way, and the way that Auth0 tells you to do it, is you send it in an authorization header. You preface it with a bearer scheme. This is a kind of an OAuth thing. You can say authorization header should have a value of bearer and then the access token. The access token comes from a call that we make to Auth0's get access token silently function. So here's some work with React state and using the use callback hook and use effect and all that sort of stuff. We're getting a token. We're getting it silently again under the hood, and then where it comes into GraphQL specifically, I suppose if you're using Apollo on your front end in particular, in this case, because we are using an Apollo client, you're going to put it into your requests that go to your GraphQL API. So, typical Apollo setup here, but then you would set your context for your requests that go out, and you would augment them with a header that has your access token. So cool. So that's going to send your access token to your API. We can actually see that in our call to our GraphQL API here. The request headers contain this access token. So that's what came back from Auth0 when we got the token silently, and it's now what's being attached to requests that go to the API. So that's half the battle, the front end side of things. It's also important, I mean, it's vital in this case to address the API. And I suppose you could say that maybe this is only a quarter of the battle or even less. And the API side of things is where most of it comes into play. If we take a look over at the server that we've got, this is a pretty typical Apollo server GraphQL API. This is one that's got a set of resolvers, a set of type definitions, as you typically would see with an Apollo server. So there's the type definitions here. And now what we've got built into it as well is GraphQL Shield. If you're unfamiliar with GraphQL Shield, it's this really nice library that does a lot of the work of checking authorization for incoming requests for you. And the way you can think about it is you would, like if you're working in an Apollo setup, for example, is you would have your type definitions, you would have your resolvers, and then you would have sort of a third layer, which is your permissions layer. And that's where you lay out what each resolver has to abide by before it resolves data out. So for our queries, I want to say that my dashboard data, I just want users to be authenticated here. And if they are authenticated, then I can release the data. For others, though, I'm looking for a particular scope. I want the inventory items that are in that inventory page. I want users to have that read inventory scope before that data goes back, and similar on throughout. The thing to note here is that these permissions that you set up, these are all just functions that effectively return a Boolean. So we're just looking for true or false here on these functions. I've got is authenticated being defined here with this rule. Rule comes from GraphQL Shield, helps us to set up this rule where we are able to get information that you would have in your resolver, things like the parents, the arguments, the context, etc. And I'm looking for a user to exist. I want the user to be there to know that my API should consider that request to be authenticated. So where does user come from? That is happening down here when we set up our Apollo server. We are setting up some context, and that's an async function, gets the request, the incoming request that comes in, and it's going to do some work to take that authorization header, that JSON Web Token that came from Auth0. It's going to take that, and it's going to verify it. So when you get a JSON Web Token, and you send it to an API, to a backend, if the backend is doing its job properly, it should be verifying that token. And verifying a token consists of making sure that the signature portion is valid against some kind of either shared secret, if you're doing a synchronous variety of JSON Web Token signing, or against a public key set, if you're using an asynchronous variety, which is what Auth0 does here. Once that's all taken care of, once we know that the token is valid, and also take into account there is whether the token is expired. Once that is all taken care of, we can get the decoded portion of the token, which is the payload of the token. And in fact, what I'm logging out down here in the console is the payload of the token. And it's this payload information that can be used now to drive decisions that are made in our API resolvers. I can take things like the user ID, for example. I'm using a Mongo database to resolve out this data, and I've got this user ID that I put here on a custom claim. This user ID is going to be used to go and retrieve certain pieces of information from the database. And the reason that I'm able to just take this user ID and ship it off to my database queries is because I can trust that this JSON Web Token, that the information within it hasn't been tampered with, as long as the token is verified. If anyone tried to modify the contents of a token while it was in flight, or if a user got access to their JSON Web Token and the dev tools, and they tried to like elevate their permissions or something, they wouldn't be successful, because doing so would throw off the signature portion, and the token wouldn't be verifiable here at the backend. So because we are able to trust this information, we can use things like this user ID in our resolvers. I can give you an example of that too. If we go up to our resolvers and we look for maybe inventory items, here is, so this is a query. I'm taking the user ID off of my context, which was that specific custom Mongo user ID. I can show you down here where I'm putting that on. It's right down here when we return our decoded portions of the token to pass along through context. I'm returning the full user object and also a user ID, because there's going to be a lot of cases where I just want this specific user ID off of context. And so now that it's on context, we can go up here and into our resolvers. We can pull it off of context and pass it along to our database queries to get that information. So that's cool. Before requests get to those resolvers, though, we want to use GraphQL Shield to tell our system whether or not the request should even be able to make its way on. And so again, back at that is authenticated rule, that's where we're just checking to see if a user exists at all. In the work that we did there in setting up our context for our Apollo server, If the token was not valid, we would not have a user would just be null. And so is authenticated, this would return false, and that request would not be able to proceed onward. We've got this other one. This is kind of a custom job here where we've got a function that wraps a rule because we want to take an argument when we use it down here in our permission setup. And so here we're just looking again for it to return a Boolean to us, and we want to check if it has a certain scope or not. Again, read inventory. That's the one we want for inventory items. And when we're looking for has scope, we're just taking the scopes that come in on the user's JSON Web Token, and we're splitting them because that's a string down here. We want to turn it into an array, and we want to make sure that the user scopes include the required scope. So the scope that we're saying needs to be present on this this particular resolver. So this should give you a sense of like how you would start to apply these rules to various portions of your API. GraphQL Shield is really nice because it provides a lot of convenience functions for you. You can start to combine these rules. You can start to say like that they have to, two of them have to be present or one of them must be present, things like that. The other way that people often do this kind of thing, if you don't want to bring in something like GraphQL Shield, is to just take the user off of context. So do the work of putting the user onto the context object that makes its way throughout your GraphQL API that will end up in that context argument. Take the user off of there and just make a check right in your resolvers to say whether or not the user is authenticated. So in this case, I've got this function called check user role, which could take that user off of context, and it could say there has to be certain roles present or certain like this, certain scopes present. So something like that. You could just run this function right in your resolvers, and that would give you protection like that. Another way to do it, if you're using a schema first approach, is to come down to your definitions, and then you could create like a directive here, a custom directive, something like has scope. So you could apply some custom directive, and you could say the scope has to be like read inventory, something like that. I'm not sure if this is the way you'd pass an argument. Perhaps you would do it without outside of a string or something like that. But you could apply some directives to each portion of your schema, and you could start to mark off certain fields that should be allowed to send data back or not. So all sorts of various ways to do it. That's sort of aside from the fact that we've now got Auth0 working in the API. To get back to the Auth0 part of things, the way that Auth0 is going to work in your API, it's independent of Auth0 itself. You don't need to necessarily be too concerned with communicating a whole lot with Auth0. You do need to communicate a little bit, and that little bit is you want to send a request to this URL, which you are going to get when you do a request. You're going to get this URL when you sign up for an Auth0 account and you have a specific tenant. So we can take a look at this. If I copy over this portion of the this URL, and then I come over here to my Auth0 account, or maybe what I could do actually is do React security us.auth0.com/well-known. There we go. So here is the key that is being requested on the from the backend when we send a JSON Web Token to it that we want to verify against. So this is the JSON Web Key Set. This is what Auth0 is going to be. When Auth0 creates an access token for your users, by default, they're doing it in an asynchronous fashion using the RS-256 signing algorithm. And this is the JSON Web Key Set that's going to be used to verify the JSON Web Token. So that's kind of the limited amount of communication that you need from your API side. This can be cached in your API as well. There's like a caching strategy that says that you want to keep this information around for a little while so that you don't have to constantly be hitting Auth0 every time a request comes to your API. But that's how you set up Auth0 on that side. So I'm just going to check where we're at for time. I think I've got a couple minutes left. And what we'll probably look at now is just maybe one more thing in Auth0 side, and that's going to be this rules section. There's some information in the JSON Web Token that's coming back from my user that I've augmented here. And one of the cool features about Auth0 is that you've got this rules engine, which is going to effectively intercept requests that come in to authenticate users and run some custom logic that you might want to provide. And what makes this really powerful is you can start to do things where you make external requests maybe to another service. You can log some data from the user's authentication transaction. You can send it to another logging service, for example. You can make outside requests. You can work with data that's present within this the context of your user. And that's what I'm doing here is I'm taking the roles for a user and putting it on that roles key, roles claim rather. I'm also taking a user ID that comes from my my backend, from my database, and I'm putting that onto the access token so that we can use it at the API. So lots of different ways that you can play with this, lots of different things you can do. And people often ask me, like, would I recommend Auth0? Would I, recommend something else? I think, the fact that we've got so many third-party Auth0 or third-party authentication services is great. There's a lot that we can do to save time. There's a lot that we can do to be confident that our applications are more secure, because it's the job of these companies to make sure that security is really tight. I recommend Auth0 because it is probably the best one that I've seen around. I've spent a lot of time playing with different services. Auth0 is probably the most flexible one I've seen. So even though I don't work there anymore, I definitely still recommend it. If you're using Nexus, so we haven't touched on Nexus today. That's the GraphQL stuff that Prisma takes care of. We've got Nexus Schema, Nexus Framework. If you're into a code-first GraphQL API and you want to use Auth0, there's a plugin that allows you to do that with Nexus, and it's really cool. Like it helps you to do this really quickly. So you can come over here to Nexus plugin Auth0. Plugs right in. You can do the same kind of thing that we've just seen, protecting your GraphQL APIs. So I think I've probably been talking for long enough. One thing I'd point you to if you want to know more on this kind of thing is I've got this course. You can go to reactsecurity.io. We talk about Auth0, we talk about GraphQL APIs and protecting them, securing them, etc. So I invite you to come check out all of this content if you are interested. There's a whole module on third-party authentication providers, including Auth0. And once again, that's at reactsecurity.io. You can reach me on Twitter. Please do. This would be great. It would be great to hear from you on Twitter. I'm at Ryan Chenky on Twitter, right there. And come say hi. Again, I'm at Prisma now, so I'll interact with you about Prisma stuff, about security stuff, anything you want to talk about. And with that, I suppose we can probably take some questions now, Daniel.
Okay, Ryan, thank you so much for that. That was really insightful. I learned a bunch of things. One of the things I guess I had as a question was how important, what do you use audiences for with Auth0?
Yeah, so I kind of skimmed over that, but in the API section of the Auth0 dashboard, there is this spot where you specify a name, an identifier for your API. And you want to have that as your audience because you want to say that your JSON Web Tokens, your access tokens, should only be allowed to be consumed at certain places. So if you have multiple different APIs and you are authorizing users from one central location, and you want user A to be only to be able to access API A and user B, API B, etc., you would set up a different audience for them. And you would say that in their JSON Web Tokens that they have a certain audience. And then once they're, so then once they send their tokens to the APIs, the audience is verified. And that means that user A can't access user B's API, that kind of thing.
So it's like kind of a way to segment, a hierarchical segmentation. So you have an app, and an app can have multiple audiences. And so that's something you would use in the context of, say, an app that has multiple sort of APIs or...
Yeah, you can sort of think of it in some of those terms. I mean, audience, like as a term, comes from it comes from Oauth. Like that's something that you'll see in Oauth, and it's one of the parameters that like needs to be present in when you're doing Oauth type work. But yeah, you can kind of think of it as like segmenting your API, excuse me, segmenting your API so that it's only accessible by certain access tokens.
Great. And we have some questions coming in. I guess you've addressed the question of using from Sean Grove. How do you feel? Okay, do you feel the Shield approach is easier, more secure compared to custom auth directives on the schema?
So is it easier, more secure? I think it's easier, definitely easier. I can't speak necessarily to the security aspect of it because I haven't thoroughly dug in, nor have I seen like too many things security wise, if it's like a better approach or not. But I think that if you're using custom directives, you're going to be setting up the rules and how all of that works on your own. You're going to be needing to do things like taking in the AST, the GraphQL AST, and walking that and marking off, using information in it to mark off certain fields as accessible based on certain conditions. There's a lot of work to do there to verify that everything is working correctly. So perhaps if you want an easier time, go with Shield, and you might end up more secure anyway.
Thank you for the question, Sean Grove. Okay, and we'll take maybe one last question. Does Prismographql currently support end-to-end encryption for the API responses?
Well, the end-to-end encryption piece, I think, would be more closely tied to your deployment, like your network. You would, and it depends exactly what you mean by end-to-end encryption too. But yeah, like if you're talking about end-to-end encryption, like request comes in, it's encrypted. And then maybe if it's going to a load balancer and then to like a compute resource encrypted along that path as well, that's more something on like the networking side of wherever you're deploying to. But yeah, you're not going to be prevented from doing that in your GraphQL API if you set that up properly wherever you're deploying to.
Right. Okay, we're about to wrap up. I'd like to thank you so much, Ryan, for the insightful talk. And yeah, hope you enjoy the next doc too.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.